So last time we discussed hazardous and solid waste. We also brought up the case study of Kirstenstad, located in Sweden, which is a representation of a waste-free city. We also discussed how mayors in the United States define zero waste for themselves and what steps that they determine are important to achieving zero waste in their cities. We also discussed something that happened here last decade, the Kingston ash spill as a result of too much coal ash piling up by the Tennessee Valley Authority in our area. We also discussed what the waste stream is and where our trash ends up in landfills or in incineration systems, and ultimately perhaps harnessing that power to produce biogas and methane. And then lastly, we discussed proper recycling techniques and composting. So today we're going to discuss economics and urbanization. And to start out, I'm going to point you to the textbook and suggest that you read these pages outlined here. If you have a different version of the textbook or edition of the textbook, the page numbers might differ slightly, but you should be able to find the case study, the what do you think, the key concepts, what can you do, and what do you think. So first, let's discuss cities in general. Cities, of course, are places of crisis, but also opportunity. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, about 300 years ago, cities have grown rapidly in the number of people that live within them. Right now, more than 50% of humans across the globe now live within city limits. And it is predicted within the next quarter century that that figure is going to be closer to 75% of all of humans living within cities. This is, of course, a dramatic change from all of previous human history, in which time most humans lived through means of hunting, gathering, farming, and fishing, which really had them situated in more rural settings, more connected to the land around them. Let's take a look at a table from your textbook. This is table 15.1, which shows us the urban share of the total population in percentages. So here we have different countries, or excuse me, different continents. We've got Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, North America, Oceania, and then finally the world total here. So just looking at the world total at the bottom, in the year 1950, about 38.3% of the global population was living within an urban setting. Fast forward 50 years to the year 2000, that number rocketed up to nearly 60%. And so, as I mentioned previously, we can look toward projections and models to understand where we will be in the year 2030 as it relates to how many humans are living in an urban setting. And that figure is close to 70% here. So that just shows you the exponential increase in the amount of humans that are living in an urban setting. We can look at this in another way. So here we have a graph that shows on the x-axis the year, going from the year 1950 all the way projected out to the year 2030 in 10-year intervals here. And then on the y-axis, we have population represented in millions. Okay, so this 500 here is 500 million. This would be 1,000 million or a billion, so on and so forth. And we can trace out the different trends for these different settings here. So first, in the solid orange, we have urban, more developed. And then we have in the dashed orange, urban, less developed. And we see by and large that the urban, more developed has remained steady throughout this time period that this data was gathered for. However, the percentage of people living in a less developed urban area has really increased steadily since about the year 1970. Let's contrast that trend with what we see for rural settings outlined in blue. So rural, more developed settings are showcased in this solid blue, whereas less developed rural settings are in the dashed blue. And we see that more developed rural settings have decreased slightly, but the trend is still there, decrease in the amount of people that are located within that more developed rural setting. And then here in the dashed line that's blue, we notice a distinct difference in the starting place. Okay, so all of these other lines, they started just about 500 million individuals. But what we see for the starting position, or the y-intercept of the less developed rural setting, there were far more people that in 1950 or just before 1950 would call that type of setting their home. And so throughout the years, throughout probably until about the year 2000, it was increasing in the amount of population that was in a less developed rural area. But since that time, it has petered off and is now beginning to decline, and it is predicted to continue declining into the year 2030. So those broke down cities into urban, more or less developed. But we also need to shine a light on a new trend that is occurring in the creation of mega cities. And these are forming worldwide. And we have several mega cities in the United States, most notably in the Northeast region, which we'll talk about on the next slide with a video. So what do we mean? We have these huge urban agglomerations, which are simply mergers of multiple municipalities. And all of these mergers really blur the lines between different city limits, making one big mega city. So some have become these megacities with populations over about 10 million people. So these cities, these megacities, they pave over huge amounts of landscapes, and they consume inconceivable amount of resources for development and transportation and housing. They also are relatively efficient in their resource use. And we can actually look to these megacities as examples of ways to live sustainably. So New York City, for example, it's one of the largest cities in the world. It has actually established for itself new codes that determine what green building looks like. So how to conserve energy and resources while erecting new structures and new neighborhoods, but also how to live sustainably within those new neighborhoods in terms of water conservation, and the city helping out with establishing infrastructure for recycling and things of this nature. In addition, these megacities also have the very huge benefit of easily accessible public transportation. And New Yorkers use public transportation and walk to get around more than any other population in the United States. So all in all, environmental degradation would probably be much worse if that many people, those 10 million people, were spread across the countryside. So those are some things to consider. But now let's delve into what we mean by megacities and urban agglomerations.
Often when talking about a city, metropolitan area and urban area are used in seemingly interchangeable ways, but these terms are quite distinct and refer to different areas and populations. However, combining these two areas, along with nearby cities, combine to form what is known as a megalopolis. A megalopolis is a cluster of cities that, including their suburbs, create one massive urban complex, like a megacity. The concept is a new one, as humans have industrialized, and that industrialization boomed the populations of urban regions. John Gottman popularized the idea with his writing Megalopolis, which proposed the idea that eventually the area between Boston and Washington, D.C. could become one massive megacity. Today, it can be argued that this megalopolis idea exists in many areas across the world, and that Gottman's ideas are starting to come to fruition. While Gottman was referring to Boston, Washington's area, Boswash as some call it, every populated continent on Earth has megalopolises, all spanning multiple cities. Let's start with one that inspired Gottman's work in the first place, which spans cities including New York City, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. The population of this area is over 52 million and is consistently densely populated between all the cities and their suburbs. This inspired the idea of Megacity 1 from Judge Dredd, which in the future spans a much larger size from Quebec to Florida and as westward to the eastern border of Ohio. Down in South America, a massive megalopolis extends through the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil that contains 3/4 of the state's population. With over 32 million inhabitants, this area is known as the expanded metropolitan complex of Sao Paulo. It includes the two cities of Campinas and, of course, Sao Paulo. This isn't the only area included, however, as over 70 municipalities are included. This makes it the largest megalopolis in South America and third largest in either of the Americas. Over in Europe, megalopolises expand between nations as the continent makes massive metro complexes between cities easily possible. These megalopolises are curved, forming a banana shape, the green, golden, and blue bananas. It could be argued that the area is the largest megalopolis in the world, stretching over 1,000 miles across, spanning 8 nations and 24 cities. The blue banana is one of, if not the best example of a megalopolis in the Western world. The London area is the largest contributor to the high population of the blue banana, with nearly 14 million citizens, while the Italian city of Milan is the second largest city in the belt with over 8 million. Overall, the cities alone combine for a population of over 90 million, and including all residents, the number increases to over 110 million. The largest megalopolises unsurprisingly exist in Asia, where in China we have the Pearl River Delta. This area is potentially the largest single urban area in the world, where estimates put the number close to 120 million residents. This is where considerations for megalopolises and their size really start to matter. It's rather subjective where lines are drawn in these megacities, as some say specific areas can be included in an urban area, where others say it can be a separate entity. At any rate, Asia consistently houses the largest urban areas. Depending on the definition of megalopolis, a larger area does exist. The island of Java in Indonesia. It's the most populated island in the world, and also potentially the largest urban area in the world with 140 million people. That's the same population as the largest country on Earth, Russia. Java is over double the population of Great Britain, and a population density per kilometer almost 4 times that. The concept of megalopolis started as a prediction for the future. The idea was that urban areas would become almost indistinguishable as separate areas, and a megacity would form. While this concept hasn't completely reached fruition, several areas have achieved what can be considered an urban area that would be unprecedented in decades past, and certainly have the potential to rival the original concepts for the megalopolis. This is Cody of Geography Hub.
Isn't that fascinating? Megalopolises. And to lend some credence to that boss wash idea, you can get on an Amtrak train in Washington, D.C. and ride all the way up to Boston. And that saves you a flight, saves you a really long car ride. And so by and large, they're already very, very much so connected. So here we have another table from your textbook, 15.2. This is showing us the world's largest urban areas, populations represented in millions. And so it gives you an idea of the trends that we see going from the year 1900 to the year 2011. So these large cities, they just keep getting larger. In the year 1900, only 13 cities in the entire world had populations over 1 million. Now, contrast that 1 million figure to what we just saw in that video where Great Britain, for example, has 64 million people. That is just really not a lot of people. By the year 2012, there were at least 400 cities with more than 1 million residents. And 100 of those 400, so an entire quarter of the most populated cities in the world, were located in China. And then finally, if we take a look into the future, what is projected by the year 2025, it's expected that at least 93 cities will have populations over 5 million people. So globally, of the largest 13 metropolitan areas, none are in Europe. Only New York City and Los Angeles are in a developed country. And so it's expected by that year, 2025, at least 93 cities will have populations of 5 million, but also that 3/4 of those cities are going to be in developing countries. So that is something also to consider. Let's take a look at the map of the world's largest urban centers. So here we have represented the span of the globe with population in the year 1984 represented in this darker orange, and projections for the year 2025 represented in this lighter peach color. And the population size is represented by the size of the circle. So for example, let's focus in on Mexico City here. We see that in 1984, we potentially had between maybe 20 and 35 million. That is projected to grow by the year 2025 to surpass probably 35 million. Somewhere else that's considered to be growing at a faster rate is Jakarta here. So you'll notice that in 1984, the population really didn't surpass about 10 million, just taking a look at the size of the circle and making a best estimate. But fast forward to not too far in the future, 2025, that number is going to be closer to 20 to 35 million here. We can take a look at a different example. For example, Tokyo, we don't see a difference in the two different colors. They largely overlap with each other, which means that the population is not going to grow or is projected to not grow by the year 2025. So what is causing this population growth? It could be increased birth rates, but we know that as a whole, populations are declining in their fertility rate. And we are, particularly in the United States, not having the birth rate match up the death rate, and therefore populations will decline. Instead, what is driving this increase in the number of urban city goers is immigration to the cities. And this immigration is driven by the push and pull of several factors. So people have different and varied reasons for wanting to move from a more rural setting to an urban setting. Number one, there might be an elimination of jobs because of new mechanization and systems in place that drive people away from their jobs, meaning they've been replaced by a new, more efficient system, and they need to go to the city to find new opportunities. They also can seek new opportunities for better housing, as well as entertainment and seeking out a better social life, maybe wanting to expand their social networks. And another important consideration is having the freedom in the city from those constraints of more traditional customs and the associated lack of gender parity and equality that a city might afford you instead of your rural village. And so a lot of times younger individuals in a population might leave those traditional customs behind in their village of origin and go to a city to explore their new freedoms and seek new opportunities, especially if their custom dictates that they were not guaranteed certain rights and freedoms, perhaps because of their gender. And also governmental policies, they often favor urban over rural areas. And this provides both a push and a pull of people into cities. So all in all, possibilities exist in the city for upward social mobility, prestige, and power that's not ordinarily available in the country. And in particular, cities, they have more funds to support specialization in arts and crafts and professions for which really there isn't a market in that rural setting. So what are some of the problems of cities? We are familiar with some of them, including congestion, pollution, water shortages. All of this has to do with an influx, a rapid influx of people to an urban center. So concentrated traffic and unregulated factories will degrade air quality for everyone that is living in the neighborhoods surrounding those factories. And in particular, China has a whole lot of those factories and is a massive industrial center. It is, of course, the world's largest producer of greenhouse gases. And in Beijing, for instance, the number of cars on the streets has more than doubled in just the past 5 years to nearly 5 million cars. So not only are they dealing with air pollution that's stemming from industry, but also because of the influx of cars that people are using to get to those industry jobs. The World Bank warns that China is home to 16 of the world's 20 cities with the worst air pollution. And so they blame this pollution for more than 400,000 premature deaths each and every year, which is extremely disheartening and sad because the worst air quality that we have on Earth are in developing countries that can't afford to deal with the rapidly growing populations that bring in all of this pollution. And so it's really a double whammy for these cities. Something that we also need to consider is that with an influx of people, these cities don't have enough sufficient housing for those individuals. The UN estimates that 1 billion people live in crowded, unsanitary slums. And what we mean by slums are these tent cities. They're really inadequate housing, doesn't have running water, no plumbing to facilitate working toilets. And these slums, they typically ring the outskirts of most major cities in the developing world. And that's because these individuals, they came to the city seeking an opportunity. They want to work in the city, but they don't yet have the means to afford their own housing, or housing is just extremely inaccessible. So the estimates right now stand that there are about 100 million people that have no home at all globally. And so in India, for example, it's estimated that 500,000 people sleep on the streets, on sidewalks, and also in traffic circles because they can't find any other places to live. These slums, they are generally legal, but of course they are inadequate. And they're especially inadequate to house multiple generations in a single family. These families, they live in crowded small rooms together with inadequate ventilation and sanitation. Often, as is very clearly seen in this image, these structures are rickety and just unsafe. So how can we plan for a better urban setting? The question is, can we live together in cities in ways that are environmentally sound, socially just, and sustainable in terms of economics? Starting with Greek cities thousands of years ago, planners have debated the best ways for humans to organize ourselves in a city setting. So this is a very, very ancient question, quite literally. And getting people around a city within a large city limit is often one of the most difficult challenges to face if you are a city official. The automobile and the development of freeways, they allowed people to move even further out into the country because they were able to commute back into the city. But again, that added stress, and now we understand more carbon emissions commuting back and forth each and every day. And that phenomenon of having your home outside of the city in which you work is called sprawl. So once these compact cities have spread over the landscape, that is called urban sprawl. And that is a recognized pattern of development that is occurring all across the globe, and especially here in the United States. There might be areas in your hometown, for example, that never were developed before, but people have identified that as a place to build suburban communities and have people live in those communities while they commute to the bigger city. It might be more affordable, but this leads to sprawl. Here we have the different characteristics of what we're talking about. Urban sprawl. Number one, we have unlimited outward extension. It just keeps growing and growing like little tendrils out from a central mass. You'll have low density residential and commercial development in those sprawled areas. You have something called leapfrog development that consumes farmland and natural areas. So approaching a farmer to buy out his farmland to create a new shopping center, for example. There's also fragmented power among many small units of government. You might have small little suburban centers that are in a different city district from the neighboring one. And so you might have power struggles and imbalances while trying to plan for a better city. There's a dominance of freeways and private automobiles. Again, you don't have that access to public transit. There's no centralized planning or control of lands, which all goes back to that fragmentation of power. There are these widespread strip malls and big box shopping centers like Walmart and Target just popping up all over the place. There's great fiscal disparities among localities. So you might have one neighborhood that's really affluent and rich sitting right next to one that's pretty poor. There's a reliance on deteriorating older neighborhoods for low income housing, and that low income housing does not get rehabilitated because people are focusing their time, energy, and resources into developing these new complexes. And finally, you'll have decaying city centers as new development occurs in previously rural areas. Something that is a direct manifestation of the sprawl that occurred within the last decade is this suburban development in American cities that led to these really expansive and expensive McMansions. Okay, so this is one example of how suburban development added directly to that problem of urban sprawl. So in most American cities, the bulk of new housing is in large developments in inexpensive rural land. That is, to the benefit of the developer because there are few restrictions on land use or building practices. But we can fast forward and look at lessons learned, and hindsight is always 2020, right? So housing experts now claim that the overbuilding during the past decade's housing bubble left us with about 40 million McMansions in drive-only suburbs that no one wants anymore. Okay, so just imagine all of these different neighborhoods that look like this with sprawling backyards that are these huge, huge homes that were built in the year 2007, 2008, and that people just don't want to live in them. And they're sitting there empty. And therefore, this converted farmland is now just absolutely going to waste. Something else that is associated with urban sprawl is the construction of freeways, again, for those commuters that are in those suburban parts to get into the city. But these freeways can lead to traffic congestion and wasted fuel, not to mention those increased CO2 emissions from tailpipes. So the freeway system, as it was originally designed, it was designed with national defense in mind. But now, if we look to our freeway systems, our highway systems, our infrastructure and bridges, they are all overburdened and they are deteriorating. So much so that the idea of an infrastructure week within the past administration, the previous administration, became a long-running joke. It's undeniable that a lot of resources and attention need to be paid to our deteriorating highways and bridges just out of safety. I mean, to be honest, not necessarily even to just alleviate the congestion, just we don't want collapsing bridges, please. So the average US driver spends 443 hours per year behind a steering wheel. And if you add that up and put that into an equation that we understand, that is one full 8-hour workday per week in a car. Okay, and that's just on average. That's not considering those individuals who spend a very long time commuting every day, upwards of 90 minutes to 2 hours commuting just one way. So as Americans, we are spending a whole lot of time in our cars. Another way that we can get around this, in addition to putting some funding and attention into our existing infrastructure is to re-envision our infrastructure and look to model cities who have really solved this problem in creative ways. One of those ways is a light rail commuter train, which looks something like this. You'll find them in different areas across the globe. I've ridden them in DC, I've ridden them in Germany, but a lot of American cities now are restoring these light rail systems that were abandoned in 1950. And that was because people saw freeways as the future and neglected these light rails. But now more and more attention is being paid to the possibilities of these light rails, really solving some of those congestion and CO2 emission problems. The light rail is energy efficient and it's popular. The problem, though, is that it can cost up to 100 million per mile when we are talking about rehabilitating or constructing new light rail systems. So a little bit of investment can pay dividends in the future. It's just really getting these ideas off the ground and getting our legislators to listen to what the people want.